This is not just about Prince Andrew and Virginia Giuffre. This is about powerful men, plural, and vulnerable women, plural.
No one serves justice. Ghislaine Maxwell is behind bars. Epstein is dead. Prince Andrew is still, as you said, Prince Andrew. But it is much, much bigger than him. The Epstein story goes to New York, Palm Beach, London, Paris, Mexico. It is a global ring of paedophilia.
It's John.
It's Emily.
And on Friday evening, with a thud, a brief statement was issued by the palace, well, by Prince Andrew, where he says, in discussion with the King and my immediate and wider family, we have concluded the continued accusations about me distract from the work of His Majesty and the royal family. I have decided, as I always have, to put my duty to my family and country first. He is no longer the Duke of York. He is no longer a member of the Order of Garter. He is still living in Windsor Lodge, the 30-bedroom palace on the Windsor estate. He is still Prince Andrew. But undoubtedly, this mega statement came because of the impending publication of the new book by Virginia Giuffre, which is coming out this week.
Yeah, by the time many of you are listening to this, you will know about this memoir. It's called Nobody's Girl, and it was finished by Virginia Giuffre, the woman who accused Prince Andrew of raping her, essentially, 3 times. It was finished in October of last year, and less than 6 months later, Virginia Giuffre had taken her own life. And in the book, you will find a harrowing, devastating account of that life of abuse. And one of the things that we will come to learn is that she wrote believing that she was fighting this abuse, making it known to help other victims. It's what she said her whole life. I want to make these stories known because I want to overcome it. I want to be a warrior. I want to be the person who takes on predatory men who always seem to escape justice. And she's now dead. So she was clearly unable to continue with that life of unbearable pain. And what we have in this memoir, what we will soon all be able to read about, is the very specific details of how she was drawn into that web of abuse, how she, in her own description over time, we've heard, became complicit. And the role that Ghislaine Maxwell also played alongside Epstein in procuring, pulling in to this horrendous web underage girls for Epstein's consumption.
Well, let's dig into all of that, and we're kind of going to take you through this sort of as we can, because I think that one of the things, and you use the word harrowing, and it is harrowing, and I'm sure people will find it harrowing, is that this didn't start with Epstein and Prince Andrew. It goes back a lot further.
Yeah, she's going to tell us that she was first abused at the hands of her own father, less than 10 years old. And these are claims that she makes in the book that her father denies. And that her father's friend was also an abuser. And there was even the idea of a swap, that 2 paedophiles would swap their own children with each other. So, I mean, why am I going into this kind of detail? Because I think it prepares the ground for what happens later. That she claims to have been abused by her father, claims to have been abused by her father's friend. It becomes totally understandable that she will then run away. She then gets picked up by another paedophile who runs a modelling agency. She becomes his kind of sex slave for 6 months until he turfs her out. And it is only when she then goes back home and starts a job at Mar-a-Lago, working sort of, basically folding towels. She wants to train to be a masseuse. She thinks this is a proper professional job. And she will describe how important it was to sort of work in a rules-based order. So Mar-a-Lago actually comes across very well here as a place where there were rules, there was a uniform, there was a sort of hygiene code of conduct. She even meets Donald Trump, and...
Who she speaks glowingly of.
She does. And she says that it was Trump who then said, if you want to come and babysit, there are lots of families here, sort of high-end elite families who'd love to have a babysitter in the evening. Would you like to do that? And so she really, really wants to have a job. She really wants to be something other than a sex slave. She wants to train as a masseuse. She goes to babysit, kids of the family staying at Mar-a-Lago. And one day, a car pulls up behind her. And it is the moment that she will meet Ghislaine Maxwell.
Yeah, and we played that clip at the top of the podcast of Virginia Giuffre outside the court where she wants to see people brought to justice. The only person that has been brought to justice for what happened was Ghislaine Maxwell, who is still in prison, having been moved to a less high secure prison as a result of goodness knows what was going on. But anyway, she is in a less secure prison, but she has been convicted. And what I think people will find striking is this phrase apex predator, but not being used about a man, but being used about Ghislaine Maxwell.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were less boyfriend and girlfriend, but more, in Virginia's words, two wicked halves of the same whole. And what she describes is the really invaluable role that Ghislaine Maxwell played in creating this web of paedophilia. The idea that there was a woman involved with a posh voice, with a friendly manner, with beautifully manicured hands, made it all seem normal. And so every time she or the other women started to doubt themselves, there is this very vivid description of the first time she goes to massage Jeffrey Epstein. And it's Maxwell who says, put a dab of cream on your arm there when you're massaging so that when you run out of cream, you don't need to stop the massage. You just take it off your arm and go and start with his feet and push the blood up. And she shows Virginia how to do this massage on the feet and then the calves. And Virginia says, I didn't want to touch his buttocks. He's naked on the table. And Maxwell goes, don't be silly. You can't be squeamish about this. Otherwise, the whole rhythm is lost. And you just get the sense of how Virginia was carried along with this. She keeps looking at the woman, the Maxwell, and going, I'm being silly, aren't I? It's all fine. And it's Maxwell who says, just take your clothes off. You'll be much more comfortable taking your clothes off. And so she plays an absolutely pivotal part in breaking down the defences that Virginia Giuffre would have naturally had as a young woman. It is Maxwell and Epstein that abuse her. It is Maxwell that makes Virginia feel that if she says no, she's somehow, overthinking these things. I thought you want to be a masseuse. Don't you want to be professional? Don't you want to learn? Don't you want to study? I'm helping you. And she will describe how Jeffrey Epstein himself wants to be seen as a mentor, not a predator. After sex, he will start to describe to her, how the markets work, or the Greek gods, or he'll tell her about the ways of the world. He'll tell her about art. And it's almost like he wants to be in this position of teaching rather than, he doesn't want to think of himself as a predator. He wants to think of himself as somebody who's sort of elevating her, giving her these great chances, right? I mean, this is all stuff that we know, but it is frightening to suddenly understand just how powerful it was to have that extra woman in the room.
Yeah, I think what she will say is that, there were no bars on the windows. There was no prison. But she was absolutely trapped by the sort of coercive control exerted by both Ghislaine Maxwell and by Epstein himself. Now, Ghislaine Maxwell, of course, has been moved to this lower security prison because, there's talk that it's possible that Donald Trump will pardon her because Donald Trump has got his own problems as well with Jeffrey Epstein, that there are all these people in Congress who want the Epstein files to be released so that the public can see what has gone on. And you can see how much this is in the public interest. If there were all these rich and powerful men who were going to Epstein's island or being flown around by Jeffrey Epstein to get the favours of young women who are there kind of almost being trafficked, then sure, the public need to know this stuff. But of course, Donald Trump thinks that anything that comes out might reflect badly on him and so doesn't want it to come out.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of people who, up to this point, sort of fell into the sort of school of thought, which is, it's men's crimes and one woman is paying the price for it. And in Virginia Giuffre's account, what becomes much clearer is just how culpable Ghislaine Maxwell was. So this idea that Trump would somehow find a pardon for Ghislaine Maxwell because, she'd sort of said nice things about her to Todd Blanche in the testimony, I think will become a lot harder once people digest Virginia Giuffre's words this week. And I think what you say, what you raise is a really good point, and it's something that I guess a lot of people think and feel, maybe uncomfortable asking. Well, she was free to go, wasn't she? There were no bars on the window. She was getting paid. She was getting her own apartment. She was getting a flat paid for by Epstein. Why didn't she leave? And I guess that is the hardest thing to understand. And I wouldn't be able to answer that myself, but I've talked to a lot of abuse victims, and I think there were two things going on with Virginia. One was that, as I said at the beginning, she came from this incredibly broken home. She even admits that Maxwell and Epstein seemed to her at times like parents. They took on the position of being kind of parents in this absolutely dysfunctional family. But the other thing was that Epstein made very clear he has a photo of her brother on his desk. He says, I know where he goes to school. He says, I control the Palm Beach police. In other words, they send out signals which are threats. If you leave, you are putting your brother in danger. If you leave, you cannot go to anyone because I control the police. I mean, all these things to a vulnerable 17-year-old, I think start to explain why someone feels more trapped than maybe the physical sense of whether they are or not. But I think there's also, in her own words, this idea that she is made to be complicit. She does feel complicit in this. She even describes how she procured other girls for them, something that she says it was the worst thing she did in her life. She will never forgive herself for. She told the girls what would be expected, but they would get pocket money. They would pay, they would get paid for sexual favours. But she becomes complicit in their web, which is, she says, the worst thing of all.
And that's so interesting because I suppose the flip side of the coin of Epstein's subtle threats of, I know where your brother is or whatever, is exactly the reassurance that the men who are abusing these young girls want. Yeah. Oh, I can do this, and no one's ever going to find out of it. And into that world enters Prince Andrew, feeling safe that none of this will ever come to light because everyone is going to keep quiet about it.
Yeah, I mean, the first time she meets Epstein, he asks her, when she first lost her virginity. He asks her about her relationship with her parents. He asks her if she's on birth control. In other words, he knows he's got somebody absolutely at their most vulnerable, at their most broken. The girls in other interviews, victims of Epstein, I am calling them girls because they were girls at the time, have described a life being snapped into at the moment they met Epstein. A childhood suddenly ending at the point where he took over, because he had an absolutely brilliant sense of finding the most vulnerable women, the most vulnerable girls, and knowing that he could get away with whatever he wanted. And she describes in great detail being taken to London, and Ghislaine pulls her aside and says, you will do for Prince Andrew, my friend Prince Andrew, what you do for Geoffrey. And a lot of this will be very familiar to our listeners because I guess they will have watched the Newsnight interview that we did in 2019. And she describes going out in London, Tramp nightclub, going back to the flat in Belgravia, this tiny little Kodak camera that she carried around with her everywhere, the disposables, and she hands it to Jeffrey Epstein and says, will you take a picture of me? And the prince has his arm round her. Ghislaine is just in the background. The banisters of the stairs in Belgravia are just in shot. And this is the moment where, in terms of evidence, everything hinges on that, because Prince Andrew is photographed with his arm around Virginia Giuffre, with Ghislaine Maxwell in the background, and it is there then that Virginia Giuffre makes those claims that Prince Andrew then takes her off and has sex with her. She is told to please him, and she gets paid money by Epstein for doing that. This is something that Prince Andrew has continuously denied.
And another revelation that's going to be made in the book, that there was an orgy, and that Prince Andrew was part of this orgy where there were 8 women and 2 men.
Him and Epstein. Yeah. And that happened, it was the 3rd time in her claims that she had sex with him on the island Little St James that Epstein owned. She describes it as Little St Jeff's. That's what he wanted to call it. St Jeff's. I mean, where do you start? But there has been another account from somebody who worked on the island of seeing Prince Andrew, and in their words, sort of frolicking by the pool with a number of young women. And I think it is that scene that Virginia then goes on to describe. She calls it an orgy between 8 young women, many of whom didn't speak English, and Andrew and Epstein. With Epstein, she remembers this line joking that, women that you couldn't communicate with were the easiest ones to deal with. In other words, they didn't have English, so you just sort of, you did what you wanted. And that then opens the door to so many more claims, which is not just that Prince Andrew had sex with Virginia Giuffre 3 times, but possibly with other women whose names we don't even know.
Yeah, and if you read Andrew Lowney's book, maybe not that many more people have come forward from what happened on Epstein's Island. But if you read Andrew Lowney's book, which is a pretty unsparing biography of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, as we now call them, it is that this was happening around the world. Wherever Andrew went, there were young women who were being served up to him. There's another story in the book, and that people I'm sure will find distressing as well, and this concerns a pregnancy.
So Virginia Giuffre will tell us that she lost a baby just 4 days after she flew back from that orgy with Andrew and the 8 other girls. Epstein's baby, we assume. And she describes how they landed at Teterboro Airport and says she wasn't in great shape, and later she woke up in a pool of blood. And that Epstein took her to a hospital, and she was heavily drugged at this time. I mean, not just after the medical procedure, but because she'd been on a lot of Xanax and a lot of sort of painkillers, frankly. She describes herself as sort of going in and out of consciousness this whole time because presumably, she was living a fairly unbearable life at that stage. So she wakes up to find him whispering to the medical professionals about her own care. And what she will describe is that she had this tiny incursion, sort of cut near her tummy button, which was consistent with keyhole surgery. Somebody else kind of explains to her what this means. Epstein had told her she'd had a miscarriage, something altogether different, and a doctor had come up to her and said, you might never be able to have children. So you're left trying to piece together what this means, that she had been taken to hospital in a pool of blood, she'd lost a baby, she wasn't even made aware of it because it was a conversation between her abuser and the doctors, and she finds this tiny scar, which is suggestive of an ectopic pregnancy, and is just landed with the news that she'll probably never be able to have children.
It is difficult to listen to some of this stuff, but when we come back, we're going to talk about where this leaves Prince Andrew and the rest of the royal family in what they do about this troublesome prince. So we talked about the Prince Andrew statement of him stepping back from his royal duties and the fact that he was no longer going to be the Duke of York and the membership of the Garter. But there was also a whole pile of other stuff that he said in this very brief statement, that I've always been a person of honour. I deny every, allegation against me. Well, one of the allegations against him now is that he bloody well lied to you. And that is absolutely clear. Now, either he didn't send the email after the interview in which he said, let's carry on playing, in his email to Jeffrey Epstein, or he didn't say to you in the interview, I cut off all contact with him. You can't have it both. And so I'm kind of left with this frustration of people saying he denies all allegations against him. It's palpably clear that some of what he's saying is not true, and it makes you question everything else that he said. And I still wonder, look, he's stood back from his royal duties. It's probably the best that the royal family can hope for. But there are still an awful lot of things where I don't think there is satisfaction that Prince Andrew has, he's still going on in a cloud of disbelief saying everything's fine. I've done nothing wrong.
By the time Virginia Giuffre finished writing her memoirs, 6 months before she took her own life, she had faced consistent denials about her story from Prince Andrew, even though he'd settled to a figure of around 12 million, we understand, but without guilt. She'd also been gagged from actually talking about that in the Queen's Platinum Jubilee year. In other words, you're back to this place once again of powerful men silencing vulnerable women. And no one serves justice. Ghislaine Maxwell is behind bars. Epstein is dead. I mean, she even raises the spectre of whether or not he was killed in jail. I know that's, something that a lot of people have considered, including her own father in the past. Prince Andrew is still, as you said, Prince Andrew. Whatever he chooses to use by way of title, whatever, notepaper he writes on, he is still Prince Andrew, living in a 30-bedroom, whatever, house on the royal estate. And Virginia Giuffre describes, in a way, what it would have been like to live a life that didn't pursue justice. She could have had a much simpler life. She ran off to Australia. The reason she ran off to Australia, actually, was that Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein turn round to her and say, we've decided we'd like you to have our baby, like a modern-day handmaiden. I mean, can you imagine any greater sense of ownership than forcing a young woman to have your baby and then explaining that she won't really be the mother? You'll be the mother. You're going to have the baby. You'll have our baby. We're going to take your baby, and it's going to be our baby from then on. And this is the point at which Virginia Giuffre breaks. She just snaps, and she finds a very clever way of getting out of their grasp without alerting their suspicion. She says, send me off to Chiang Mai in Thailand, a wonderful spa where I'm going to learn to be a masseuse. You promised me that I would always be a professional masseuse. Just give me the chance to go and do my lessons, my instruction. And so they go, fine, you can have, a couple of months there, go off and do that. She lands in Chiang Mai, she's in Thailand, she's on her own for the first time in 2.5 years, and she falls in love with a man there, and they marry within a week, right? I mean, if that doesn't spell PTSD, I don't know what does. But this is the man who she will then leave Thailand, married to start a new life in Australia, and she will make a phone call to Maxwell and Epstein and say, you can't touch me now, I'm married. And Epstein will say, have a nice life. To get to that point, we will learn about all the other abusive men in her life as well. There is, she quotes, a former prime minister who repeatedly choked her until she lost consciousness and took pleasure in seeing her fear for her life. We don't know who that is.
And
she
we
doesn't
don't know
name
what
the
country. Yeah.
We do not know. And obviously they haven't come forward. For days it hurt to breathe and swallow. He raped me more savagely than anyone had before. We will hear about the kind of sadomasochistic sex that Epstein has. We will hear about the number of times that she had infections, urinary tract infections, because she'd slept with so many men in such violent and extreme kind of conditions that she was constantly in and out of hospital, in and off antibiotics, on painkillers the whole time. And so I think that takes you to the place where she then tries to escape, she then runs away, and she goes to Australia. And at that point, she tries to live a normal life. She doesn't want to start pursuing justice. And it's only when Epstein gets back in touch with her in 2006-07, when the FBI are on his case, that she... And even then she says, I want to make it all go away. But she finally ends up realising when she has her baby girl that this is something she wants to do for other women. And this is where the story with Prince Andrew essentially starts. When she comes forward, she gives an interview to American broadcasters and says, it is time I spoke out.
And this is where you're absolutely right, Emily, to talk about how this is not just about Prince Andrew and Virginia Giuffre. This is about powerful men, plural, and vulnerable women, plural, and how powerful men. But the Prince Andrew is almost like a paradigm example of what powerful people can do. You talked about a figure of, I think, 12 million to settle a court case. The FBI wanted to interview him. He wouldn't be interviewed. He could have had his day in court. He could have explained why this is absolutely monstrous that he has been charged with these things. He chose not to have his day in court. He chose to cough up 12 million instead. That is making a problem go away. That is using your power to kind of ensure that justice is not done, that there are NDAs, that there are gagging clauses, that there are things that will keep people quiet. And so, this story is about much more than Prince Andrew, but he's sort of emblematic of the story in what he has done to ensure that nothing gets out. And so when you still see every news organisation in the world doing as it has to do, Prince Andrew has categorically denied all the allegations. Yeah, we've all got to do it, but it is somehow unsatisfactory given the opportunities that the Prince has had to come out and say, well, what do you know?
This weekend, we heard the Met Police are opening an investigation into why Prince Andrew passed on Virginia Giuffre's security number, presumably obtained from Epstein himself in the days when he was still alive, and tried to smear Virginia Giuffre, tried to drag her name through the mud. In other words, if you can make the person who's testifying against you seem like an unbelievable witness, then you've destroyed their reputation, they're out of your way.
Look, the sheer act of that, and this is a small geeky point, but it needs to be made, is that access to someone's social security number should be totally impossible. In the United States, you get this 9-digit social security number. When I used to go into the White House, the Secret Service officers would say, last 4 numbers of your social. They would never ask. No one ever asks for your entire social security number because that has your identity. That has everything.
It's like your DNA, isn't it?
It's your DNA. No one ever gives it out. So the fact that Prince Andrew, in an email to his deputy communications director at the time, at Buckingham Palace, this is her social security number. We want, I've asked whether there could be an investigation. That is so on the wrong side of the line of what is acceptable to do. How he got hold of it, I mean, presumably from Epstein, but that suggests a degree of collusion. These are questions that are legitimate to be asking now about what Prince Andrew was involved in trying to smear her. We also understand that, it's alleged that he tried to get trolls involved, kind of to be out there on social media, to besmirch her name, to spread to, trash talk her.
Yeah.
It's wrong.
I mean, there's a moment where Virginia Giuffre describes a photograph taken on holiday with her 2 young boys before her daughter was born, and says that was the moment I could have chosen just to live my life, in Australia, on the beach, calmly getting on with my family life. Instead, what she does is she goes back into the fray and she goes, no, I'm going to fight. I'm going to become the warrior. I'm going to raise my voice. I won't be silenced. I'm going to fight for other people. And this kind of example tells you why so few women may have chosen to do that. Because you've been through a life of abuse. You've been through whatever physical torment comes, alongside the emotional abuse. And then you find that your reputation is being trashed, that people are hanging out in your driveway, that people are coming to threaten your family, that you don't ever escape from this because too many people with too much power and too much money realise that for the first time you are a threat to them, and then they try and shut you down.
Well, I've spoken to someone, close connections to the royal family, who's said about Prince Andrew, this person said, he's basically extremely stupid, but now he's cornered and he's trying to cling on to what he's got left. And the frustration, I think, from Buckingham Palace's point of view is that there's not much they can do now. It will take an act of parliament to strip him of, the title and all the rest of it. It seems that he has got a lease that is legally binding for Royal Lodge. He said, back in the day, the ideal solution would have been to banish Prince Andrew to a little tiny cottage on the Balmoral estate where he would never be seen again and he would just live out his life quietly there. But he's still very close to London. He can still do whatever he likes. And they say that his arrogance, stupidity, sense of entitlement, the thick-skinnedness means that he will just carry on being Prince Andrew and carrying on being a thorn in the side of the royal family. And the one thing this person said to me is that Prince William is a lot less tolerant of it than the king, and that will change when the prince rises to the throne.
Yeah, I guess one of the questions that people are trying to ask is why now? The memoir explains part of it. The King's trip to the Vatican to see the Pope explains another. They're fed up, quite frankly, of all the headlines being about Prince Andrew. But I think there's another thing, and that is a very sensitive issue, which is we know the King has been ill, and there is probably a place in his mind where he's thinking, I don't want to leave things unsettled. I don't want to leave the dodgy uncle problem for my son, for William. And presumably between King Charles and Prince William, they're thinking this has to be sort of sorted, whatever sorted looks like. There is a world, of course, in which Prince Andrew says, let me stand trial, right? I will go, I will stand trial. Maybe that is the most wholesome thing that he could do. And there's also, and I feel this actually really strongly, a world in which we kind of, you're so right to say that Prince Andrew kind of epitomises so much of the story because it's about wealthy, powerful men and vulnerable women. But it is much, much bigger than him. The Epstein story goes to New York, Palm Beach, London, Paris, Mexico. It is a global ring of paedophilia. And we don't know the names of many of the other men involved. We know people who had associations with him. We know people who had money from him. We know people who owed him favours. But we don't really know how many other men were involved in this, how many men were complicit in his crimes, or really the total number of women that went through his grasp. And so I guess there is a moment at which we stand back and we say, this is not just a story of royal protocol. It's not just a story of titles. It's not just a story of where Prince Andrew lives. It's a story of how complicit so many people were in what happened during that decade. It's also a question of why that trial into Epstein in 2007 was shrunk into a tiny plea deal. What was going on at the Department of Justice? Who spoke to who about what? You've mentioned Alex Acosta in the past, the man who converted what should have been the trial of the century
into a plea deal.
Into a plea deal. There were 40 witnesses or more, young women who'd already given their stories to police, already come forward, talked to the FBI, told their most gruelling, intimate, humiliating stories of what happened. And what happens? Epstein gets 18 months on a plea deal in an open prison where he's out during the day and is still seeing, as far as we understand, underage girls during that time and just goes to prison to sleep at night. What on earth happened there? So I think there are so many bigger questions, really, into how so few people have been held accountable for what went on over decades and decades. Today has been, I don't know whether to apologise or not really, but a pretty hard listen. It's a tough listen, isn't it? The book is out tomorrow, and we will have plenty more details, plenty more to discuss then, the ramifications of that more widely.
We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.